It is the 2nd of October in the year 48 BC. Gaius Julius Caesar has arrived in Egypt, landing in the capital, Alexandria. He is here to catch Pompeius Magnus, his foe in the civil war for control of the Roman Republic. However, upon landing, Caesar learns that Pompey has been killed by the servants of Pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra. Displeased with Pompey's killing, Caesar distances himself from the boy pharaoh and soon turns against him after forming a relationship and alliance with his co-ruler and sister, who wants to rule Egypt herself, and perhaps, with Caesar's help, an empire. Her name, Cleopatra, the last queen of Ptolemaic Egypt. The woman known to history as Queen Cleopatra VII of Egypt was most likely born early in 69 BC in the city of Alexandria, the capital of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. Though her date of birth is uncertain, and it could have been in late 70 BC, her name is derived from the Greek word kleos, meaning glory, and pater, meaning father, so her name effectively meant glory to her father. It was a common name within her family, and many Egyptian queens in the century and a quarter before her birth were also called Cleopatra. Her father was Ptolemy XII, the Basileus, king or pharaoh of Egypt since 80 BC. The identity of Cleopatra's mother is less clear. It is presumed that it was Cleopatra V, a surprisingly mysterious queen of Egypt, who only appears in a few fragmentary records, but who was definitely a wife of Ptolemy XII. The Egyptian kings, though, were known to practice both incest and polygamy, which confuses matters and makes it hard to be sure if Cleopatra V was her mother or not. If she was, she possibly died when her daughter was a toddler, though again, this is not certain. Cleopatra had several siblings. Two sisters, named Berenice and Arsinoe, are attested to, as are two brothers, both of whom were called Ptolemy, like their father, the name that virtually every male member of the royal family in Egypt at this time was given, creating a challenge for historians. Whether these brothers and sisters were full siblings or half-siblings of Cleopatra's is unknown, though we can say that Ptolemy XII was definitely their father in each instance. Cleopatra was born 2.5 centuries into the inception of Ptolemaic rule in Egypt. The Ptolemaic kingdom was one of the successor states to the empire that Alexander the Great had swiftly conquered and briefly ruled in the 4th century BC. Alexander had conquered Egypt from the Persian Empire in 331 BC and ordered the construction of a new city at the mouth of the river Nile Delta, which he named Alexandria. He then left the country and headed eastwards, conquering all of Persia and campaigning to India, beyond the edges of the known world. His untimely death in 323 BC, at just 32 years of age, had opened up a succession crisis, as Alexander's only legitimate child was still in his mother's womb at the time, and there was no consensus as to who should rule in his stead until he came of age. A civil war consequently erupted amongst Alexander's generals and close companions for control of various parts of the empire. One of them was Ptolemy, a Macedonian general of considerable repute, who enjoyed support among some sections of the army. Over the next several years, In what have become known as the Wars of the Diadochi, or Crown Princes, Ptolemy established himself as ruler of Egypt, while several others secured control over other parts of the empire. Eventually, Alexander's child and heir, Alexander IV, was murdered in 309 BC, and the Diadochi dropped the pretense of fighting to preserve the empire for Alexander's child and established their own kingdoms. Ptolemy became King Ptolemy I. In addition to Egypt, he secured control over parts of Libya, the island of Cyprus, and much of the Levant north along the coast towards modern-day Lebanon. The great rival of the Ptolemies here, which they would fight with in many wars, was the Seleucid Empire, which ruled from central Turkey east to Persia. The kingdom of Macedon controlled Greece itself. The Ptolemaic kingdom emerged in the 3rd century as the greatest of the Hellenistic kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean world to result from Alexander's conquests. Alexandria was built into a magnificent city by Ptolemy and his successors, Ptolemy II and Ptolemy III, a great centre of learning, complete with the foremost library of the ancient world. Many of the most fundamental early breakthroughs in the fields of mathematics, astronomy, geography and science were made by scholars like Euclid and Eratosthenes at Alexandria under Ptolemaic rule. Furthermore, while the Seleucid Empire began to lose much of its sprawling territory in the east to newly emergent powers like the Parthian Empire of Persia and Macedon's control over Greece fragmented as new alliances of city-states emerged, the Ptolemaic kingdom managed to build a strong, centralized rule which flourished into the 2nd century BC. However, things were beginning to change long before Cleopatra was born. The center of military, economic, and political power in the Mediterranean Sea had always lain in the east. That is, until the rise of 2 major powers in the western Mediterranean, the Roman Republic in central Italy and Carthage in North Africa. After 2 decisive wars between them in the 3rd century BC, Rome emerged as the dominant power of the western Mediterranean. It wasn't long before the Romans began interfering in the eastern Mediterranean. Though they proved reluctant to rule over distant territory in the east for much of the 2nd century BC, by the time Cleopatra was born, all such reservations had long been abandoned. Just a few years after she was born, a Roman general, Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, defeated the Seleucid Empire and brought it to an end, forging Syria into a Roman province. It was into this precarious situation for the independence of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt that Cleopatra was born. Cleopatra grew up in the most cultured and learned city in the world, and she must have received a very good education, visiting the precinct where the Great Library was located in the Museum, the complex of religious and cultural buildings in the city. It seems plausible that her father would have instructed some of the city's leading scholars to oversee his children's education. To get a sense of how dynamic the intellectual environment was here, consider that Hero, a Greek scholar associated with the city, was born right around the time Cleopatra was, and many years later would develop a working steam engine in the city. Had the Roman world exploited this technological breakthrough, it would have laid the grounds for a Roman industrial revolution. Cleopatra was believed to have been well enough educated that she wrote some medical texts in Greek during her youth. This story was later attested to by Arab scholars who might have had access to evidence which is now lost. It is open to doubt, though, given how common the name Cleopatra was in ancient Egypt. Perhaps they simply confused her authorship with that of another female scholar. Beyond this, her youth was lived in a hybrid culture. The members of the royal family were Macedonian from a genetic point of view and Greek from a cultural perspective. However, they ruled over Egypt, a very old culture that had its own traditions gathered over 3 millennia, going back to when the first pyramids were built. As such, the royal family adhered to many Egyptian traditions, particularly the worship of the Egyptian gods and goddesses, like Osiris, Isis, Ra, Ta, and Amun. She grew up taking part in religious rituals involving these deities. Because of the cosmopolitan nature of Alexandria, she also learned to speak many languages, including Greek, Latin, Egyptian, and Hebrew, and perhaps others like Syriac and Ethiopian. Something which has garnered a lot of attention in modern times is the issue of Cleopatra's ethnicity and what she would have looked like. Although she would become one of the most famous female rulers of the ancient world, one widely written about by over 50 ancient historians and writers, there are few detailed ancient depictions of Cleopatra. There are several sculptures that are believed to be of her, yet these are not coloured. There are also a lot of smaller images. A side profile image of Cleopatra was incorporated into coins which were produced in Egypt during her reign, and she appears in many other royal guises around Egypt. The problem is, a coin, or indeed an ancient sculpture from which the paint that would have been applied has long since faded away, does not reveal skin colour. Consequently, several studies in recent decades have tried to suggest that Cleopatra was dark-skinned and African in her appearance. There is no real evidence to support this conclusion. The Ptolemies were a Macedonian dynasty from the core of the Greek world. They might have ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, but they did so as a foreign dynasty, controlling the country from a Greek capital in the far north of Egypt. Moreover, the Ptolemies were known for inbreeding, with sisters even marrying brothers, as we will see, in order to secure the royal dynasty's control over Egypt without challenge. Admittedly, her matrilineal descent is not 100% clear, yet the images on coins from her reign and other archaeological artifacts make it pretty clear that she had Hellenistic features reminiscent of a Macedonian or Greek, rather than African. Cleopatra's life was being shaped from infancy by events in the wider Eastern Mediterranean, and in particular the expansion of the Roman Republic to dominate the region. When she was just a toddler, the Roman commander Pompey had been dispatched by the Roman Senate with a great fleet and army to flush out and eradicate the large pirate fleets which operated out of the Greek islands and parts of the coastline of Asia Minor in Turkey. This campaign proved so successful in 67 BC that he was then appointed to take over the war against King Mithridates of Pontus on the Turkish coast of the Black Sea. In a blistering series of campaigns, Pompey not only finally defeated Mithridates, but then conquered the remnants of the Seleucid Empire and annexed it in 63 BC. He then engaged in a reorganization of the Eastern Mediterranean, which included making the Kingdom of Judea into a client state or vassal. Egypt was now the last remaining major independent power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Its status was complicated. The Romans had been interfering in the politics of the Ptolemaic kingdom for almost a century already by the time Cleopatra was born. When her father's predecessor, Ptolemy XI, had died in 80 BC, he had left behind no male heir, and the Romans had debated annexing Egypt for a time before Cleopatra's father became the new ruler. Still, the Romans had taken advantage of the situation to carve off Cyprus from the Ptolemaic dominions. They gave the island to another Ptolemy, an illegitimate half-brother of Ptolemy XII, who ruled the eastern Mediterranean island as a Roman vassal thereafter. They eventually annexed the island in 58 BC. Meanwhile, throughout the 60s BC, as Cleopatra was growing up in Egypt, the issue of potentially annexing Egypt, a region coveted for its agricultural abundance and the riches of Alexandria, was regularly discussed within the Roman Senate, a sign of how precarious the independence of Cleopatra's homeland was and of her family's position as its rulers. The issue of Rome's influence in Egypt swirled all around Cleopatra and her family as she was growing up. Soon it led to her voyaging to the city of Rome in person. This came about owing to a political crisis in Egypt and its former dominions. As we have seen, Rome annexed Cyprus in 58 BC, which had until recently been a long-standing part of the Ptolemaic dominions. This caused a lot of political friction in Egypt and unrest against the rule of Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, which culminated in Ptolemy being removed from the throne. Power brokers at the Egyptian court in Alexandria then placed one of his other daughters, Cleopatra's elder sister Berenike, on the throne. The details of a lot of these events are very shadowy. The ancient sources, historians like Cassius Dio and Eusebius, and the geographer Strabo, who was a contemporary of Cleopatra's and lived in Egypt for a while, do not reveal who the court conspirators against her father were. They do allude to the idea that there was some Roman interference that led to Ptolemy being forced off the throne. Nevertheless, Ptolemy decided to now appeal directly to the Roman Senate. He left Egypt and headed for the Eternal City, after Berenike and the new government had placed him under pressure to leave Egypt. Interestingly, he brought Cleopatra with him. Why is unclear. They travelled via Rhodes and Greece to Italy, and then finally took up residence at a villa owned by Pompey the Great on the outskirts of the city. They would end up waiting for nearly a year to be given an audience before the Roman Senate, where Ptolemy pleaded his case to be restored to his throne. This was the beginning of an extraordinary set of political machinations and scheming. Back in Egypt, Queen Berenike's government had elected to send its own embassy to Rome to argue the case against Ptolemy being restored to power. This was led by Dio of Alexandria, a leading philosopher of the time. When he and his embassy arrived, Ptolemy went to work with his allies in Rome to undermine them. Dio was, by all accounts, poisoned. Powerful Roman backers of Ptolemy then argued the case for war to place him back on the Egyptian throne, while others suggested that prophecies and bad omens foretold danger for Rome if it intervened directly in Egypt's military and political affairs. What young Cleopatra must have made of all of this is uncertain. She was still a child of just 12 years. Presumably, her education continued in Rome, and we can imagine that it was during this year spent in the capital of the Republic that she became fully conversant in Latin and developed a greater awareness of Roman manners, customs, and society, information she would utilize in years to come. In the end, the petitioning of her father in Rome did not reach a constructive conclusion, but Pompey nevertheless intervened on his behalf. He instructed Aulus Gabinius, the governor of Syria and an ally of his, to intervene in Egypt to aid Ptolemy. The deposed king returned east with his daughter, and over the course of several months, Berenike was removed from the throne in Egypt and executed in 55 BC. Ptolemy also purged the court of his opponents with the aid of his Roman allies. In the aftermath of the power struggle, Cleopatra was in a stronger position as a favoured daughter. The whole episode is also important in stressing the ties between Pompey and the Ptolemaic dynasty. A certain Mark Antony, a young Roman military commander who would go on to feature prominently in Cleopatra's story, was also involved in the Roman intervention in Egypt in 55 BC. Cleopatra's position as her father's designated heir was indicated in 52 BC when she was made a regent. He had also stated his wish that she would become queen after him in his will. He was well into his 60s by this time and might expect to die before long. Cleopatra would not rule by herself, though. Her young brother, who, as we have seen, was either her full or half-brother, was also designated as co-successor. This arrangement was designed to allay any concerns about a female ruler succeeding. In any event, if Ptolemy XII died soon, Cleopatra would be the de facto power, as the younger Ptolemy was only born in the late 60s BC and was a boy of no more than 10 or 11 when Cleopatra became regent in 52 BC. Thus, when her father died less than a year later in early 51 BC, Cleopatra ascended as Queen Cleopatra VII. She herself was only around 18 years old at the time. Thus she became the more powerful ruler following her father's death. Long-standing Egyptian custom, stretching back many centuries to long before the country had come under Macedonian rule, involved the royal family practicing incestual marriage, and Cleopatra and her younger brother, whose regnal number was Ptolemy XIII, married one another after becoming king and queen. Cleopatra's coronation was a mixed one, reflecting her family's position as a foreign Hellenistic dynasty ruling over Egypt. She ascended in Alexandria and ruled from the northern city surrounded by a largely Greek community of intellectuals and courtiers. At the same time, following her accession, she travelled south to Thebes to take part in Egyptian religious rites that signified her accession as Pharaoh of Egypt. This was the ancient capital of the Egyptian New Kingdom, back in the Bronze Age of the 2nd millennium BC, synonymous with modern-day Luxor. The ceremony here indicated the way that the Ptolemaic dynasty lived in a dual world of Hellenistic rule and ancient Egyptian custom. The first years of Cleopatra's reign were turbulent. Her kingdom was in a difficult position, owing to the civil war that had occurred between her father and her sister Berenike. Roman aid for Ptolemy's cause had come at a price, and the royal dynasty owed millions of silver coins to powerful backers in the Roman world. Another issue was a poor inundation of the River Nile. This was the annual flooding of the Nile, which caused it to deposit rich alluvial soil all along the banks of the river for hundreds of kilometres. The inundation no longer occurs because of the construction of the Aswan Dam in the 20th century, but in ancient times it was key to Egypt's agriculture and its position as a major centre of civilization. The failure of the inundation in the first months of Cleopatra's reign caused food shortages and even localized famines. On top of this, the politics of the East had been destabilized when a very large Roman army, led by Marcus Crassus, had been destroyed by the Parthian Empire of Mesopotamia and Persia at the Battle of Carrhae in June 53 BC. The Parthians were making incursions into Rome's eastern territories in the aftermath, leading to Roman calls for assistance from its Egyptian ally. Most worryingly, the intervention in 55 BC had also led to a powerful Roman military faction setting up camp in the country. This was a force of 2,000 Roman legionaries and 500 cavalry, who had arrived as part of Aulus Gabinius' forces from Syria to restore Ptolemy XII to the throne. Afterwards, they remained in Egypt and began to adopt Egyptian customs and play a role in its politics. The Gabiniani, as they became known, began to express greater support for Cleopatra's brother, Ptolemy XIII, as time went by, a development which made her position more difficult. Cleopatra responded to these issues in a variety of ways. The failure of the inundation and the decline in agricultural produce that it brought about was remedied by stopping Egypt's export of its large agricultural surplus. But this was a delicate balancing act. Egypt was, along with the island of Sicily, a breadbasket of Rome, with Egyptian grain being shipped to the capital of the Roman Republic to feed the masses of the rapidly expanding city. In dealing with her own country's needs, Cleopatra had to also try not to annoy the Romans, who depended on Egyptian grain. It would take time to pay back her family's debts, though extensive Egyptian trade into the Red Sea and Indian Ocean was a lucrative source of revenue, as the Egyptians acted as the intermediary for Rome in its acquisition of rare commodities that came from faraway lands in South Asia. The most pressing thing, however, was dealing with the Gabiniani, who had become increasingly lawless. In 50 BC, when Roman emissaries arrived from Syria to try to recruit them for a defence of Rome's eastern border against the Parthians, the Gabiniani murdered the Roman diplomats. This placed Cleopatra in a difficult position. She responded by sending the culprits to Syria to be tried there, but this earned her a rebuke for seeming to interfere in Roman affairs. She also tried to marginalise them and to outflank her younger brother, who the Gabiniani favoured. Archaeological evidence from Egypt dating to early in the reign indicates that she tried to oust her brother, and she appears on some royal inscriptions as the sole ruler. This situation did not last long, and Ptolemy XIII begins appearing as king on the royal inscriptions again from 50 BC. A new civil war between Cleopatra and her younger brother, each with their own supporters within Egypt, was brewing. This was also a period of massive instability in the wider Roman world. Instability which would impact Egypt and Cleopatra before long. Crassus's defeat by the Parthians at Carrhae in 53 BC brought to an end a political alliance that had existed in Rome since 60 BC, one known as the First Triumvirate. This had involved Crassus, Pompey, and Gaius Julius Caesar, a slightly younger rival of Pompey's. The establishment of the First Triumvirate was just one development in the process whereby Rome's wealthy politicians and generals had started to become excessively powerful. Just over 10 years before Cleopatra was born, this had resulted in a Roman general named Cornelius Sulla briefly becoming dictator of the Roman Republic after he had won a brief civil war against an opposing faction known as the Marians. Sulla had relinquished power and died soon after in retirement. However, his actions had destabilized the Republic even further, alerting all aspiring tyrants that the state could be undermined and taken over if a man were audacious enough. Caesar was audacious enough. In the 50s BC, he had become the man of the hour in the Roman Republic as he engaged in a series of bewildering conquests of Western Europe, conquering what the Romans knew as Gaul and what we know today as France and the Low Countries. He even crossed to Britain to scout out the possibility of conquering the island. As news of Caesar's conquests arrived to Rome, Pompey became yesterday's man. Still, a conservative faction in the Roman Senate coalesced around him and presented him as the defender of the Republic. As Caesar's term as governor of Gaul neared its end in 50 BC, they tried to revoke him and remove the armies he had under his command. In response, Caesar led his legions south and famously crossed the river Rubicon to march on Rome early in 49 BC. A new civil war had begun, one which Egypt and Cleopatra would soon be pulled into. The civil war between Caesar and Pompey went on for many years, yet the result of it was decided in the late summer of 48 BC. After preparing his forces, Caesar crossed to Greece and met with Pompey's army at Pharsalus on the 9th of August. In a battle which ancient accounts portrayed as a formidable victory for Caesar, who was heavily outnumbered by the Pompeians, he managed to break Pompey's lines and rout them. Thousands of Pompey's men were killed and many more were captured. Pompey himself escaped to the island of Lesbos and considered his next moves. His cause was not lost. Many supporters of his in places like Hispania and North Africa were willing to continue the fight. Cato the Younger, a prominent senator, had an army in the province of Africa around what is now Tunisia and intended to fight on against Caesar here. Taking stock of this, Pompey decided to sail for Egypt, where he hoped to acquire further support from the Ptolemaic dynasty and presumably link up with Cato's forces to make North Africa the centre of his cause. He would have assumed that he would receive support from Cleopatra, given the generous help he had provided her and her father a decade earlier, when Ptolemy XII had come to Rome looking to be restored to his throne. Pompey sailed first for Cyprus and then to Egypt, arriving there in late September 48 BC. When he arrived to Cleopatra's homeland, he was killed immediately. A party of Roman mercenaries, led by Lucius Septimius, a military officer who had served with Pompey in his meteoric Eastern campaign, in which he had conquered the Seleucid Empire 15 years earlier, stabbed him to death and then beheaded him, so that the head could be given to Caesar as proof. It is probable that the Ptolemies had ordered his murder in the belief that Caesar's victory was inevitable in the civil war. Pompey's decision to head to Egypt in the aftermath of the Battle of Pharsalus would change the trajectory of Cleopatra's life. Within a few days of Pompey's death, it became apparent that Caesar was about to arrive himself to Egypt, having learned what his rival's plans were and hoping to intercept Pompey before he could establish a new power base in North Africa. When he arrived early in October, he was apparently genuinely upset to learn that Pompey had been killed, and then his body defiled by beheading him. When he came to Alexandria, he settled in the royal palace there and considered his next moves. The civil war was far from over, and despite Pompey's death, Cato and others, including Pompey's son, Sextus Pompeius, would continue to fight on for many years. As he considered his options in the Egyptian capital, Cleopatra saw an opportunity to outflank her brother and claim power, while also preserving the independence of her native kingdom to some extent. She was outside of Alexandria at this time and sent word to Caesar that she wished to meet with him. Then, according to a detailed account left by the Greco-Roman historian Cassius Dio, she, quote, beautified herself so as to appear before him in the most majestic and at the same time pity-inspiring guise. When she had perfected her schemes, she entered the city and by night, without Ptolemy's knowledge, went into the palace. Caesar, upon seeing her and hearing her speak a few words, was forthwith completely captivated. Before long, it was known that Caesar, who was 52 years of age and married to a woman named Calpurnia back in Rome, had begun a relationship with Cleopatra, who was still only about 21 years of age at that time. Cleopatra's luring of Caesar was doubly necessary, as the power struggle with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, which had been brewing for several years, had broken out into a de facto civil war a few months earlier. Ptolemy XIII was still very young, and Cleopatra's real adversary in this was a court eunuch by the name of Pothinus, who had been regent for young Ptolemy since the accession in 51 BC, along with the Gabiniani. There was even a third faction emerging, which supported the claims of Cleopatra's other younger sister Arsinoe to the throne. Even as Caesar and Pompey were preparing their forces for the clash at Pharsalus, Cleopatra had been forced to briefly flee from Alexandria into the Levant. After gathering her supporters, she had returned to Egypt. Pompey and then Caesar had consequently arrived, as the Ptolemaic royal family were mired in conflict with one another. Cleopatra's intervention with Caesar makes a lot more sense when we consider how precarious her situation was when she first arrived before him late in 48 BC. Caesar responded to her petitions by ordering the execution of Pothinus and declared that Cleopatra was the Queen of Egypt. Ptolemy XIII and Arsinoe then joined forces. A remarkable set of events then began. Caesar had only arrived in Egypt with a small contingent of men, and in the winter of 48 BC, the dictator of the Roman Republic ended up trapped in Alexandria with Cleopatra as Ptolemy and Arsinoe's forces laid siege to the capital. They failed to break through and win the city, though, and as the weeks ticked by, reinforcements began arriving in Egypt for Caesar. At a battle in the Nile Delta early in 47 BC, Ptolemy and Arsinoe's cause was defeated. Ptolemy XIII allegedly drowned in the river Nile while trying to flee from the scene of his defeat. Arsinoe only survived because she was exiled to Ionia and took sanctuary in the temple of Artemis there. Killing her would have constituted a grave breach of religious sanctity. Cleopatra's gambit had worked. With Caesar's aid, she had reclaimed her throne and was the unchallenged ruler of Egypt once again. The issue of female rule was still a problem in Egypt, and in order to shore up her position, Cleopatra installed her other, younger brother as her co-ruler in 47 BC. To confuse matters further, he was, quite unsurprisingly, called Ptolemy as well. Ptolemy XIV, as he now became, was the youngest member of the family and was only around 11 or 12 years old at the time. His exact birth date is not known. A ritual sibling marriage was also entered into. Cleopatra's ambitions were expanding by then. She was pregnant with Caesar's child. This was an important development. Despite marrying multiple times, Caesar had only had one child from his marriages, a daughter named Julia, who had died in 54 BC, an event which had accelerated the drift to war in the Roman Republic, as she had been married to Pompey as part of the alliance arrangements of the First Triumvirate. Thus, when Cleopatra gave birth to a baby boy in Egypt sometime in the second half of 47 BC, most likely the late summer or early autumn, it was a quite significant development. Caesar now had a biological male son, albeit one born to an Egyptian queen. The latter issue was problematic and meant Caesar would have serious difficulties getting the Roman political classes to accept the child as his heir. even though he was the unquestioned ruler of Rome by then, having claimed dictatorial powers. The child was named Caesarion. By the time he was born, Caesar had left Egypt to oversee the ongoing war against Cato and other former allies of Pompey. Thus, Cleopatra set off from Egypt with her newborn child in 46 BC to visit Rome. She would spend the next 2 years living there. Cleopatra's presence in Rome was viewed poorly by many in the political class of the city. They perceived her as an Oriental queen grasping after power. There were also a lot of raised eyebrows about Caesar's relationship with her, and the possibility of him acknowledging Caesarion as an heir. A development like this would have been unthinkable amongst the Roman elite a century earlier. But Caesar had proved time and time again that he was impervious to convention and would not be bound by tradition. This was evident in his refusal to relinquish power. Caesar had claimed the power of dictatores at the start of the civil war against Pompey, on the grounds that the military emergency necessitated emergency powers. But now, with the civil war winding down and his powers set to expire, he proclaimed his wish to become dictator for life. The Romans were averse to the idea of kingship, and there was growing opposition to his decisions. Some people associated Cleopatra with this, claiming she was a bad influence on the Roman general. These included the great Roman orator and rhetorical writer Cicero, who knew Cleopatra and wrote unfavourably about her. From Cicero's letters, we also learn that Cleopatra might have become pregnant again while in Rome with another child of Caesar's, though if she did, she lost the baby. The Egyptian queen also lost her lover before too long. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, the Ides of March festival in the Roman calendar, Caesar was stabbed to death by a cohort of senators in Rome who had decided he was intent on becoming a tyrant and needed to be stopped. With his assassination, everything was in flux in the Roman world once again. After the murder of Caesar, Cleopatra only remained in Rome for long enough to have it confirmed that Caesarion had not been named as Caesar's heir in his will. Once this was clear, she left promptly. Her son would now have been a target for anyone seeking to succeed Caesar as the preeminent figure in the crumbling Roman Republic. She consequently headed back to Egypt and considered her next steps. One of the first measures that she seems to have decided upon was the murder of her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. A royal inscription indicates that he was still alive in late July of 44 BC. He died at some point over the next 8 or 9 weeks, as Caesarion was proclaimed as Cleopatra's new co-ruler at the beginning of September with the regnal name Ptolemy XV, Caesar. There is no evidence as to what happened to Ptolemy XIV. Still, the timing of his disappearance and the swift elevation of the infant Caesarion to the kingship makes it pretty clear that Cleopatra had him poisoned or dispensed with in some other way. Thus did Cleopatra bolster her position in Egypt immediately after Caesar's assassination and removed any possibility of Ptolemy XIV becoming a focus of renewed opposition to her rule within Egypt. The assassination of Caesar had set in motion new conflicts within the Roman Republic. The most prominent one was between the supporters of the murdered dictator and the faction of senators who had killed him. This is known as the Liberators' War. As soon as she was back in Egypt and had solidified her control over the throne, Cleopatra began receiving emissaries from both sides, seeking Egypt as an ally in the civil war. Her position was especially important because the war was beginning to focus on Greece and the eastern Mediterranean, where Cleopatra was now in control of the island of Cyprus. Caesar had given the island back to the Ptolemaic royal family in 47 BC, after a brief period of just over a decade of Roman rule there since 58 BC. This meant Cleopatra had control over Egypt and Cyprus, as well as a powerful fleet and a substantial army. For obvious reasons, her loyalties lay with those who were seeking to avenge Caesar's killing, and she threw her support behind them. Simultaneously, her position was compromised when the governor of Cyprus, who had been established there after the island was given to her, a man named Serapion, allied with the liberators who had murdered Caesar. This ultimately culminated in yet another plot forming around Cleopatra's remaining sister, Arsinoe, allied with Serapion and others. It climaxed in the murder of Serapion in 41 BC, while Arsinoe was murdered at the Temple of Artemis, where she had sought sanctuary years earlier. A gross violation of religious sanctity. By then, the Liberators' War had come to an end, with Caesar's killers defeated in 2 battles at Philippi in Macedonia in 42 BC. Cleopatra had curried favour with the Roman state by siding with the winning faction and remained in control of Cyprus afterwards. As the Liberators' War was underway, the politics of the collapsing Roman Republic were shifting rapidly as Caesar's potential successors positioned themselves to be the next ruler of the state. 3 figures in particular were emerging as potential heirs. The first was Caesar's great-nephew, Octavian, a young man who was only 18 years old when Caesar was assassinated, but who had been named by the dictator as his heir in his will. The others were Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, 2 long-standing allies of Caesar's, who had both served as Magister Equitum, the Master of the Horse, in the years before the assassination, a position as deputy to the dictator. Together, these 3 figures, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, formed a political alliance known as the Second Triumvirate in 43 BC. Through this, they aimed to share power within the Republic. Lepidus was soon marginalised, and events thereafter became a power struggle between Octavian and Antony to become Caesar's successor and the ruler of the Roman state. They soon reached a further agreement whereby Octavian would control the western provinces while Antony held the east. In tandem, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia, in 40 BC, and 2 daughters soon followed. However, even before Antony married Octavia, he had already begun a relationship with Cleopatra, whom Antony had first met in the east, all the way back in 55 BC, when he had been part of the Roman military intervention in Egypt, which restored her father to power. They needed each other, she to preserve her rule in Egypt, while Egypt and its great resources were also vital if Antony was to manage to retain control over the East. Still, as strategic as the relationship was when it began, it seems to have genuinely become a passionate love affair. Children soon followed. Twins, a boy named Alexander Helios and a girl named Cleopatra Selene, were born in 40 BC, even as Antony was marrying Octavia at that time, while a second son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was born 4 years later, in 36 BC. Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar had begun back in late 48 BC in a way which was quite circumstantial. Had Pompey not decided to try and regroup in Egypt after his defeat at Pharsalus, Caesar would not have ended up there, and Cleopatra would not have been in a position to woo him. In Antony's case, her actions were possibly far more premeditated and she had decided that Antony was the most likely figure to emerge victorious from the power struggle following Caesar's assassination. Most contemporaries would have agreed. Lepidus was the weakest partner of the second triumvirate, and Octavian was a very young man with only a limited power base initially. He was looking to strike a decisive blow as well by launching a great campaign against the Parthian Empire and avenging the destruction of Crassus's army back in 53 BC. Consequently, much of her relationship with Antony over the next several years took place against the backdrop of Antony readying an army of tens of thousands of legionaries and campaigning extensively against the Parthian Empire, primarily within the Kingdom of Armenia, a buffer state which the Romans and Parthians were constantly vying for influence within. Cleopatra briefly campaigned with him as far as the eastern Roman border in 36 BC, before returning to Egypt to give birth to their youngest child. As all of this was occurring, there were also growing tensions between Octavian and Antony concerning his relationship with Cleopatra and the public nature of it, even as Antony's wife, Octavian's sister Octavia, was in the eastern Mediterranean and was starting to raise her two daughters with Antony. As Cleopatra and Antony became lovers, and then the main power in the eastern provinces of what remained of the Roman Republic, all manner of stories began to attach themselves to them. Antony was rumoured to be what we would now term an alcoholic, and it was even claimed that he had written a book exclusively on alcohol and drinking. This and many other stories were symbolic of the alleged debauchery and excess of their court in Alexandria. Perhaps the most famous tale about this centres on a wager between the pair as to which one of them could hold the most magnificent banquet. Cleopatra won the bet. Stories of it included a version in Pliny the Elder's huge encyclopedia of knowledge, written a century later, the Natural History, in which he presented a tale about Cleopatra dissolving pearls in her wine and drinking them. Pliny explains it as follows: "There have been two pearls that were the largest in the whole of history. Both were owned by Cleopatra. In accordance with previous instructions, the servants placed in front of her only a single vessel containing vinegar, the strong, rough quality of which can melt pearls. She was at the moment wearing in her ears that remarkable and truly unique work of nature. Antony was full of curiosity to see what in the world she was going to do. She took one earring off and dropped the pearl in the vinegar, and when it was melted, swallowed it." It was a sign of how Cleopatra and Antony were being perceived by the Roman world in their own time that fanciful stories like this were still circulating a century later. Incidentally, the story of the pearl would become the focus of many paintings of Cleopatra, painted from the 16th century onwards. The story of Cleopatra dissolving the pearl in a goblet may have been entirely fictional. Nevertheless, the very fact that a story like this could develop in the first place and then start circulating widely enough that Pliny the Elder and figures like him were writing about it over 100 years later is revelatory in and of itself. The tale is meant to highlight a growing sort of decadence and aloofness at Cleopatra and Antony's court in the East, one in which she and her Roman lover were ruling more like Oriental despots than a conservative Roman vassal and the Republic's representative. This was doing reputational damage to Cleopatra and Antony back west in Rome. The couple did absolutely nothing to alleviate the concerns that many Roman senators might have had about their intentions. Their most egregious action came in 34 BC. Antony was fresh back to the Egyptian capital after a raid into Armenia, during which he had captured King Artavasdes of Armenia. who had allied with the Parthian Empire. The raid had been successful, and Antony returned to the city with the Armenian traitor as his captive. He now decided to hold a Roman triumph, a kind of victory parade, which conquering generals were given the honour of presiding over at Rome. His decision to hold this in Alexandria compounded the perception that Antony now believed he was effectively ruling over an independent kingdom, one which controlled the eastern provinces of the Roman Republic. To make matters worse, on the evening of the triumph, Cleopatra and Antony presided over an event known as the Donations of Alexandria. During this, they bestowed Caesarion and their own children together with a series of lavish royal titles. Caesarion was stated to be a new co-king of Egypt. Alexander Helios was named as king of Armenia and Parthia. His twin sister, Cleopatra Selene, was awarded the title of Queen of Cyrenaica, the Roman name for Libya, while Ptolemy Philadelphus had Syria donated to him and was named as king thereof. This was a striking statement of Cleopatra and Antony's ambitions to rule over the eastern Mediterranean in their own right. The Donations of Alexandria were a gift to Octavian far to the west in Rome. He already had the huge advantage of being present in the Eternal City, where he could seek to influence the Senate and other power players in the Republic's politics, while Antony was far away in the east at Cleopatra's court in Egypt. There had been rumblings in Rome for years that Antony had been exercising too much independence and was acting like an Oriental king in the east. A special issue was the idea that he and Cleopatra had visitors at her court prostrate themselves on the ground in front of them, an act which the Romans viewed as being beneath their dignity. Now Antony seemed to have confirmed the worst suspicions of many of those in Rome that perceived that he was intent on splitting the Republic in half and carving off the eastern provinces to rule himself with Cleopatra. Cleopatra featured in many of these criticisms. Many people viewed her as being a manipulative temptress who had first seduced Caesar years earlier and then moved on to his potential successor as soon as he was killed. For Octavian, there was a personal element to this. Antony had humiliated his sister Octavia through his actions. She had left the east and returned to Rome with her two young daughters, of which Antony was the father. He added salt to the wound in 32 BC when he finally married Cleopatra, without even obtaining a proper legal divorce from Octavia. The time was drawing near when war would break out between the rivals. War finally broke out in 32 BC. Octavian had waited long enough to be able to win over a substantial enough proportion of the Senate to his cause. He was aided by having illegally obtained a copy of Antony's will that had been deposited in the Temple of Vesta in Rome, which amongst other provisions included an expressed desire to be buried in Alexandria alongside Cleopatra. When the declaration of war came, it was actually aimed against Cleopatra and Egypt, where it was rumoured she and her lover now intended to establish a senate to rival that at Rome. Whether this was true or a lie concocted to benefit Octavian remains unclear. In any event, Octavian still only managed to obtain the support of a strong bloc of the senators. Many left Rome when the war broke out and went to join Antony's camp. It would be a short civil war, one which has become known as the War of Actium. This is because it was decided in one naval battle at the mouth of the Gulf of Corinth, off the coast of western Greece. Once the war began, Cleopatra and Antony decided to head to Greece to begin building up their forces here for a potential strike against Italy and Rome. At the same time, Octavian and his leading military commander, Marcus Agrippa, moved to prepare a large fleet with which to attack Cleopatra and Antony's armies before they gained the initiative. As Octavian's forces moved towards the Gulf of Corinth, Cleopatra and Antony decided to try and break out of the Gulf and split Octavian's fleet. In one of the largest naval battles in history, involving hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors, Antony and Cleopatra's armada became divided. Octavian's smaller and more agile galleys also proved more effective, and he and Agrippa won the day. Antony and Cleopatra fled with their remaining ships and men back to Egypt, their plans in disarray. The events which followed have taken on a legendary element to them. As Caesar had chased Pompey to Egypt nearly 2 decades earlier, Octavian prepared to follow Antony to the land of the Nile. He took his time, though, and travelled overland by Turkey and the Levant with his forces. Therefore, he did not arrive in Egypt until the summer of 30 BC. Despite having nearly a year to prepare for the assault on the country, Cleopatra and Antony were unable to recover from the loss at Actium, where many of their troops had remained stranded on land after they fled with their fleet. These had surrendered, and there was a shift in sentiment in the war, with many former supporters of Antony and Cleopatra now changing sides to back Octavian. When Caesar's great-nephew arrived to Egypt, his troops were tired from the long march, but aided by a separate contingent that had come east from Libya, they won a victory over Antony's troops outside Alexandria in July 30 BC. Following this, Antony took his own life by stabbing himself in the mistaken belief that Cleopatra was already dead. Plutarch, whose Life of Antony is one of the best sources for these events, presents a colourful story where Antony did not die immediately and was brought before Cleopatra, who was alive after all. Cleopatra was subsequently captured by Octavian's troops and defiantly demanded that she would not be paraded through Rome as a defeated prisoner as part of Octavian's triumph. Octavian simply told her that her life would be spared. Unsatisfied with this, Cleopatra decided to join her lover in death. The date is disputed. It probably occurred on the 10th of August 30 BC, meaning that Cleopatra was only about 39 years of age, despite the complex nature of her life up to then. There are a number of varying accounts as to how she took her own life. The most famous one holds that she had her attendants seek out a number of different types of poisonous snakes for her, and she then was bitten by an asp that killed her. However, the more plausible reality is that she simply drank some poison, and it was this which ended her life. Several accounts suggest that she approached her death in an almost ritualistic manner, eating a fine last meal and bathing before she did so. Numerous lavish theories have emerged in the centuries since about what might alternatively have happened. A plausible one is that Octavian could have had her discreetly murdered. Amongst the most implausible is that she died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Afterwards, Octavian permitted a royal burial to occur, and both she and Antony were laid to rest in a mausoleum on the outskirts of Alexandria, the remains of which have never been found by archaeologists. Cleopatra's death and the defeat of her and Antony's cause in the War of Actium brought about one of the key things which she had sought to avoid through her actions over the previous quarter of a century. Egypt was subsumed into the Roman state, as was Cyprus. This was not as inevitable as it initially appears. At this juncture, Rome was still choosing to rule many lands as client states. For instance, Mauritania, in what is now Algeria, Thrace in modern-day Bulgaria, and other regions continued to be ruled as client states until well into the 1st century AD. even though the Romans could have annexed them quite easily decades earlier. In Egypt's case, though, the ruling dynasty had been all but wiped out by years of internal conflicts. In any event, the Ptolemies were perceived as too great a threat. Despite being his cousin through Caesar, Octavian almost certainly had Caesarion quietly murdered a few weeks after his mother had died. Surprisingly, he spared Cleopatra's children with Antony and sent them to Rome to be brought up there. Both Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus died there in the years that followed, but most historians believe this may have been owing to illness rather than foul play. Cleopatra Selene went on to marry King Juba II of Mauritania, a revered scholar king. What this meant was that Egypt was annexed directly into the Roman state, which Octavian became the first ruler of as Emperor Caesar Augustus, after a series of constitutional changes in 27 BC. His power now unrivaled after the vanquishing of Antony and Cleopatra. Egypt would become a key part of the empire, one which acted as a breadbasket of Rome and Italy, delivering huge shipments of grain and other foodstuffs to the capital. Alexandria featured as the second largest city of the empire for centuries to come, and remained the scientific and intellectual hub of the Greek East. If one wanted to learn about mathematics or medicine in the Roman Empire, then one went to study in Alexandria, not Rome. Conquest of Egypt also opened up Rome's entry to the Red Sea and the emergence of a thriving trade into the Indian Ocean. Within a few years of the death of Cleopatra and the end of Ptolemaic Egypt, the Romans were sending out expeditions into Arabia to explore the region and establish diplomatic ties to the rulers there, and naval missions to begin establishing trade with India and other faraway lands. Cleopatra has become one of the most iconic female figures from the ancient world. Her name is known all over the world 2 millennia after her own time. The reasons for this are complex. Much of it has to do with her relationships with both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and the role she played in the events which led to the end of the Roman Republic and the birth of the Roman Empire. This meant that Greek and Roman historians were interested in her in ancient times. She featured in some of the most important historical works written by historians and writers of the Roman world, like Suetonius, Plutarch, Pliny the Elder, and Cassius Dio. This in turn meant that medieval and early modern writers had extensive information available about her and incorporated her into their paintings and sculptures. The story of her dissolving a pearl was especially famed and was the subject of many Renaissance and Baroque paintings. That legacy has transferred to the stage and screen in modern times. Numerous plays, films, and television series have appeared featuring the story of Cleopatra. Perhaps the most revered is William Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, yet undoubtedly the most infamous was the 1963 film Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor as the Queen and Richard Burton as Antony. It ran notoriously over budget and was seen as playing a key role in the decline of the golden age of the Hollywood studio system as a result, although it generally received favourable reviews. Cleopatra was unquestionably amongst the most famous women of the ancient world. She appears in the writings of over 50 writers from ancient times, with many historians discussing her down to the end of the Roman Empire, and also writers of encyclopedias like Pliny the Elder. That she was so regularly commented on and written about is hardly surprising. Her life was full of significant events. When she was born around 69 BC, Rome was tightening its grip on the eastern Mediterranean, and the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt that her family had ruled over for centuries was already losing its independence. Cleopatra's life was framed around attempting to maintain Egypt's independence and her own family's position as rulers of it. To that end, she first took Julius Caesar as her lover, and then Mark Antony, and had children with both men. There was an element of dumb luck to some of this. Cleopatra might have been calculated in her actions, but it was entirely beyond her control that after his defeat at Pharsalus in 48 BC, Pompey the Great would choose to flee to Egypt. If he had gone elsewhere and Caesar had not ended up in Cleopatra's homeland in pursuit of his rival, history could have been very different. Once she caught his eye and began a relationship with him, her ambitions increased. It is very plausible that she imagined that if Caesar lived long enough, he might have tried to promote Caesarion as his successor one day. When he was assassinated, her plans moved on to Antony. There is every possibility that her relationship with him was based on genuine affection. Yet there is no doubting that she also benefited from it, politically. The donations of Alexandria of 34 BC and the lavish titles bestowed on her children point towards the extent of her ambitions. However, ultimately her luck ran out. In Octavian, she and Antony faced a figure that to a significant degree was actually shrewder than Caesar himself. After biding his time, he convinced the Senate to wage war on Cleopatra in 32 BC and defeated them in a swift war. It seems likely that Cleopatra, faced with the possibility of being brought as a prisoner to Rome after Antony's death, decided to take her own life. What do you think of Cleopatra? Was it possible that she genuinely formed loving relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony? Or did she simply seduce two men whom she believed she could utilize to secure both her own position as Queen of Egypt and a degree of continuing autonomy for Egypt in the face of the continuously expanding Roman state? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.